Chapter 7. The Coming of the Colossus. After the cessation of the exodus of liches, a universal terror still prevailed, a wide-flung shadow of apprehension, infernal and funereal, lay stagnantly on Ylourgne. There were strange and disastrous portents in the aspect of the skies. Flame-bearded meteors had been seen to fall beyond the eastern hills. A comet, far in the south, had swept the stars with its luminous bosom for a few nights, and had then faded, leaving among men the prophecy of bale and pestilence to come. By day the air was oppressed and sultry, and the blue heavens were heated as if by whitish fires. Clouds of thunder, darkling and withdrawn, shook their fulgurant lances on the far horizons, like some beleaguering Titan army. A murrain, such as would come from the working of wizard spells, was abroad among the cattle. All these signs and prodigies were an added heaviness on the burdened spirits of men, who went to and fro in daily fear of the hidden preparations and machinations of hell. But until the actual breaking forth of the incubated menace, there was no one, save Gaspard du Nord, who had knowledge of its veritable form, and Gaspard, fleeing headlong beneath the gibbous moon toward Ylourgne, and fearing to hear the tread of a colossal pursuer at any moment, had thought it more than useless to give warning in such towns and villages as lay upon his line of flight, where, indeed, even if warned, could men hope to hide themselves from the awful thing, begotten by hell on the ravished charnel, that would walk forth like the Anakim to visit its roaring wrath on a trampled world. So, all that night, and throughout the day that followed, Gaspard du Nord, with the dried slime of the oubliette on his briar-shredded raiment, plunged like a madman through the towering woods that were haunted by robbers and werewolves. The westward falling moon flickered in his eyes betwixt the gnarled, somber boles as he ran, and the dawn overtook him with the pale shafts of its searching arrows. The noon poured over him its white sultriness, like furnace-heated metal sublimed into light, and the clotted filth that clung to his tatters was again turned into slime by his own sweat. But still he pursued his nightmare-harried way, while a vague, seemingly hopeless plan took form in his mind. In the interim, several monks of the Cistercian Brotherhood, watching the grey walls of Ylourgne at early dawn with their habitual vigilance, were the first, after Gaspard, to behold the monstrous horror created by the necromancers. Their account of its epiphany may have been somewhat tinged by a pious exaggeration, but they swore that the giant rose abruptly, standing more than waist-height above the ruins of the Barbican, amid a sudden leaping of long-tongued fires and a swirling of pitchy fumes erupted from Malbauge. The giant's head was level with the high top of the dungeon, and his right arm, out-thrust, lay like a bar of stormy cloud athwart the new-risen sun. The monks fell grovelling to their knees, thinking that the arch-foe himself had come forth, using Ylourgne for his gateway from the pit. Then, across the mile-wide valley, they heard a thunderous peal of demoniac laughter, and the giant, climbing over the mounded Barbican at a single step, began to descend the scarped and craggy hill. When he drew nearer, bounding from slope to slope, his features were manifestly those of some great devil, animated with ire and malice towards the sons of Adam. His hair, in matted locks, streamed behind him like a mass of black pythons. His naked skin was livid and pale and cadaverous, like the skin of the dead, but beneath it the stupendous thews of a Titan swelled and rippled. The eyes, wide and glaring, flamed like lidless cauldrons heated by the fires of the unplumbed pit. The rumor of his coming passed like a gale of terror through the monastery. Many of the brothers, deeming discretion the better part of religious fervor, hid themselves in the stone-hewn cellars and vaults. Others crouched in their cells, mumbling and shrieking incoherent pleas to all the saints. Still others, the most courageous, repaired in a body to the chapel and knelt in solemn prayer before the wooden Christ on the great crucifix. Bernard and Stephan, now somewhat recovered from their grievous beating, alone dared to watch the advance of the giant. Their horror was inexpressibly increased when they began to recognize in the colossal features a magnified likeness to the lineaments of that evil dwarf who had presided over the dark, unhallowed activities of Ylourgne, and the laughter of the Colossus, as he came down the valley, was like a tempest-born echo of the damnable cachinnation that had followed their ignominious flight from the haunted stronghold. To Bernard and Stephan, however, it seemed merely that the dwarf, who was no doubt an actual demon, had chosen to appear in his natural form. Pausing in the valley bottom, the giant stood opposite the monastery, with his flame-filled eyes on a level with the window from which Bernard and Stephan were peering. He laughed again, an awful laugh, like a subterranean rumbling, and then, stooping, he picked up a handful of boulders as if they had been mere pebbles, and proceeded to pelt the monastery. The boulders crashed against the walls, as if hurled from great catapults or mangonels of war, but the stout building held, though shaking grievously. Then, with both hands, the Colossus tore loose an immense rock that was deeply embedded in the hillside, and, lifting this rock, he flung it at the stubborn walls. The tremendous mass broke in an entire side of the chapel, and those who had gathered therein were found later, crushed into bloody pulp amid the splinters of their carven Christ. After that, as if disdaining to palter any further with a prey so insignificant, the Colossus turned his back on the little monastery, and like some fiend-born Goliath, went roaring down the valley into Ylourgne. As he departed, Bernard and Stephan, still watching from their window, saw a thing they had not perceived heretofore, a huge basket made of planking that hung suspended by ropes between the giant's shoulders. In the basket, 10 men, the pupils and assistants of Notaire, were being carried like so many dolls or puppets in a peddler's pack. Of the subsequent wanderings and depredations of the Colossus, 100 legends were long current throughout Ylourgne, tales of an unexampled ghastliness, a wanton diabolism, without parallel in all the histories of that demon-pestered land. The goatherds of the hills below Ylourgne saw him coming, and fled with their nimble-footed flocks to the highest ridges. To these he paid little heed, merely trampling them down like beetles when they could not escape from his path. Following the hill stream that was the source of the river Iswail, he came to the verge of the great forest, and here, it is related, he tore up a towering ancient pine by the roots, and snapping off the mighty boughs with his hand, shaped it into a cudgel, which he carried henceforward. With this cudgel, heavier than a battering ram, he pounded into shapeless ruin a wayside shrine in the outer woods. A hamlet fell in his way, and he strode through it, beating in the roofs, toppling the walls, and crushing the inhabitants beneath his feet. To and fro, in a mad frenzy of destruction, like a death-drunken cyclops, he wandered all that day. Even the fierce beasts of the woodland ran from him in fear. The wolves, in mid-hunt, abandoned their quarry and retired, howling dismally with terror, to their rocky dens. The black, savage hunting dogs of the forest barrens would not face him, and hid whimpering in their kennels. Men heard his mighty laughter, his stormy bellowing. They saw his approach from a distance of many leagues, and fled or concealed themselves as best they could. The lords of moated castles called in their men-at-arms, drew up their drawbridges, and prepared as if for the siege of an army. The peasants hid themselves in caverns, in cellars, in old wells, and even beneath hay-mounds, hoping he would pass them by unnoticed. The churches were crammed with refugees who sought protection of the cross, deeming that Satan himself, or one of his chief lieutenants, had risen to harry and lay waste the land. In a voice like summer thunder, mad maledictions, unthinkable obscenities, and blasphemies were uttered ceaselessly by the giant as he went to and fro. Men heard him address the litter of black-clad figures that he carried on his back, in tones of admonishment or demonstration, such as a master would use to his pupils. People who had known Neter recognized the incredible likeness of the huge features, the similarity of the swollen voice, to his. A rumor went abroad that the dwarf sorcerer, through his loathly bond with the adversary, had been permitted to transfer his hateful soul into this titanic form, and, bearing his pupils with him, had returned to vent an insatiable ire, a bottomless rancor, on the world that had mocked him for his puny physique, and reviled him for his sorcery. The charnel genesis of the monstrous avatar was also rumored, and, indeed, it was said that the Colossus had openly proclaimed his identity. It would be tedious to make explicit mention of all the enormities, all the atrocities that were ascribed to the marauding giant. There were people, mostly priests and women, it is told, whom he picked up as they fled, and pulled limb from limb, as a child might quarter an insect, and there were worse things, not to be named in this record. Many eyewitnesses told how he hunted Pierre, the lord of Lafresnaye, who had gone forth with his dogs and men to chase a noble stag in the nearby forest. Overtaking horse and rider, he caught them with one hand, and bearing them aloft as he strode over the treetops, he hurled them later against the granite walls of the chateau of Lafresnaye in passing. Then, catching the red stag that Pierre had hunted, he flung it after them. And the huge bloody blotches made by the impact of the pashed bodies remained long on the castle stone, and were never wholly washed away by the autumn rains and the winter snows. Countless tales were told also of the deeds of obscene sacrilege and profanation committed by the Colossus, of the wooden virgin that he flung into the Iswail above Zim, lashed with human gut to the rotting mail-clad body of an infamous outlaw, of the wormy corpses that he dug with his hands from unconsecrated graves and hurled into the courtyard of the Benedictine Abbey of Périgord, of the church of Sainte-Zénobie, which he buried with its priests and congregation beneath a mountain of ordure made by the gathering of all the dung heaps from neighboring farms.